The music you are now hearing is by Rachmaninoff. It is a piece called Lyric, which has never before been performed. You would look for it in vain among the composer's works, for it is, so to speak, not of this world, but was received through the mediumship of an Englishwoman called Rosemary Brown. This ordinary British housewife insists categorically and in an utterly credible manner that she is in spiritual contact with Beethoven, Brahms, Liszt, Chopin, Schubert, Rachmaninoff and others. It was roughly 10 years ago that the world heard for the first time of this British woman who receives music from the beyond. Rosemary Brown was born in London about 50 years ago. Mediumistically gifted since birth, she hears and sees things inaudible and invisible to others. She lives in modest circumstances, has received no university education, nor any musical tuition apart from a few piano lessons as a child and as a young woman. Her marriage ended in early widowhood, and she was left alone to fend for herself and her 2 children. But Rosemary Brown refused to become the sensation of the day. Rosemary Brown lives in the upper story of a small house in a suburb of London. The outward appearance of her surroundings testifies to her modest standard of living. She has received hundreds of musical pieces, works bearing the characteristics of the most famous classical composers, which have elicited the surprise and interest of musical experts the world over. Most of it has remained unpublished. Rosemary Brown has brought the meaning of Shakespeare's words, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in our philosophy," a great deal nearer to our understanding. But now, let Rosemary herself tell you about these astonishing experiences.
Mrs. Brown, this music which we've heard is very remarkable. Since when do you get it?
In 1963, I think Liszt was trying to get music to me, but he only managed then to get a few phrases across to me. But in 1964, he really began to work seriously with me.
Were you working at the time, or were you just a housewife?
Well, I was going out to work at the time because I had to support my children after my husband had died. But I was actually at home because I'd had an accident at work and broken some ribs. And the hospital had sent me home and said that I must rest, I mustn't do any heavy housework. And the time was passing very slowly because I couldn't do very much. And I decided to go to the old piano, which hadn't been touched for years. And I thought I would sit there and try to remember some little tune which I had learnt as a child. So I sat down and began to try to remember this tune, and then suddenly my hands were controlled by Liszt and began to play the most beautiful music, very difficult music.
How did this experience strike you? Were you shocked, or were you rather used to having these psychic impressions Have you not been psychic since childhood?
Yes, I seem to have been psychic from the time I was born. And perhaps we're all the same, only in some of us the psychic faculties are dormant. But mine were very active from an early age, and so when this happened, when Liszt began to contact me and transmit music to me, I wasn't at all frightened. It was a very interesting experience.
When you say you were psychic from early age, what did actually happen? How was it to be different from other people? Did you hear and see things that they couldn't see and hear?
Yes, but of course I thought at first that everybody was the same as myself, and I gradually found out that not everybody could see and hear in the same way, although of course there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of people all over the world who can see and hear the spirit. I think often they keep very quiet about it in case people laugh at them.
And when you were still a child, you saw a composer whom you didn't know at the time, but he was Liszt, and he then said that he would come back to you one time.
Yes, that's right. When I was about 7 years old, I saw Liszt. He didn't give me his name, but he said he had been a pianist and a composer when he was in this world, and that when I grew up he would come back to give me music.
Herr Professor Ten Haff, Sie sind von Haus aus Psychologe und haben sich auf Parapsychologie spezialisiert.
Professor Ten Haff, you are a psychologist, and you have specialized in parapsychology. May I ask the most important question first? Is Rosemary Brown mentally sane and healthy? Is she psychologically a normal human being?
Some years ago, I supervised a diagnostic and psychiatric examination of Rosemary Brown, and we came to the conclusion that she is, mentally and emotionally, a perfectly normal person.
Davon sind wir überzeugt. Wenn sie normal ist, besteht dann aber nicht trotzdem die Möglichkeit, dass sie
If she's normal, surely the possibility that she may get these pieces of music from her own subconscious cannot be ruled out. What is your opinion on this point?
Kein Sachverständiger auf dem Gebiet der Musik, habe aber mit Sachverständigen darüber gesprochen. Und wir kamen zu der Überzeugung, dass hier keine...
That's a difficult question. I'm no musical expert, but I have spoken to experts. And we agreed that it is not a case of the subconscious reproducing melodies without the person in question knowing that she is reproducing. Musicologists are also convinced that there's no imitation, and that Mrs. Brown herself is no composer.
Und sie sind auch der Überzeugung, dass sie kein Komponist ist, weil die Melodien...
The melodies aren't her own. They do not mirror her personality, but give characteristics of quite different personalities. We must therefore find another hypothesis.
Man muss also zu einer anderen Hypothese kommen.
Next, we travelled to Wales to ask Ian Parrott, Professor of Music at Aberystwyth University, which has been visited by many famous composers, Bela Bartok, to name but one, about Rosemary Brown and her music.
Professor Parrott, you have analyzed a good many of Rosemary Brown's compositions. Would you say they are all individual in character and recognizable as to their composers and of the same musical standard?
Well, there are two questions there. The second one about the standard, I think they do vary quite a lot in their quality, but there's a great deal of the individual character of certain definite composers which comes through. And of course I believe in Rosemary that she's a genuine person and that this is a genuine phenomenon. Some of the pieces are of a remarkably high standard, both from the point of view of the musical quality and the style of the composer.
What about Mrs. Brown's musicianship? Do you find it adequate? If not, is there not a danger that she misses something or gets something wrong?
Well, I think it's really the opposite. I think as she's a medium, it's better for her to have the minimum technique, the minimum requirement to write music. See, she's a most unusual person. Writing music is a very difficult thing, and she doesn't have great knowledge of music, but she just has that minimum knowledge of getting notes down. She doesn't really know quite what she's doing, and she's not a qualified musician at all.
Because she is not, do you agree that it would be impossible for her to fake her music?
Well, I certainly think she would be unable to fake music. She's not clever. You see, we know a lot of people, after-dinner entertainers and others, who are very good at playing Three Blind Mice in the style of Debussy or something like that. They're very clever people. Well, there's one thing about Rosemary, she isn't clever. But she produces the most extraordinary music. I mean, something by Stravinsky, for example, a year after his passing. Well, I would be surprised if any of the clever fakers could fake Stravinsky. It's a very difficult thing to do. But she steps in. She treads where fakers fear to tread.
How about the other composers? How do they appear to you?
Well, there are now a number of composers all trying to work with me, and amongst them, of course, is Beethoven, who's a very wonderful person to work with. He's always very gentle when he works with me. Doesn't seem to be at all disagreeable, as he was supposed to be when he was here. And there's Brahms, who is always very peaceful, but with a great strength. Schubert, who is a most delightful person. I think everybody would love him because he is so modest and good-humoured. The different personalities come across very clearly.
Tell me, how do you actually do the composing? Do they lead your fingers at all times, or do they give you the tunes in your mind, or do they give you the notes?
Well, they don't lead my fingers very often. Right at the very beginning, that was the way Liszt worked with me. He guided my hands at the piano, and he would play the same phrase over and over again, slowly, and I learnt it from the pattern of notes on the piano, without even knowing what key it was in. And then the music came through so much that I realized if I didn't begin to write it down on paper, I would forget some of it. And I began to try to write it out in my own way, which was rather crude. I didn't have the knowledge of notation. And then, of course, it occurred to me that I could ask Liszt to help me to write it out, get his advice on the right way of getting the notes down. And they found that this, on the whole, seems to be the best way of getting music to me, by dictating it to me, note by note, by the names, the letter names of the notes. And they have to remember to tell me all the accidentals, before a note, whether it has to have a sharp added or a flat added or something like that. With the years that I've been working with them now, I think it's become easier for them to get their work accurately across to me, because there are, of course, great difficulties in making sure that I've heard exactly what they want me to hear. It'd be very difficult for me to think they've said one note when they've actually said another, or for them to say the next note is a sharp, and for some reason it doesn't come across to me and it gets missed out altogether. So we can never be quite sure that what I get from them is exactly what they're trying to get across to me. But I think they've done remarkably well. They've got a vast quantity of music across, and for the greater part is pretty accurate. I don't hear the music first. There would be no advantage in that, because I don't have a sense of pitch. If they sang a tune to me, I would be fumbling about on the piano trying to find the right notes. I couldn't do it that way.
Humphrey Searle, a world-renowned expert on Liszt, states the following on Grübelei.
The piece Grübelei, dictated to her by Liszt in connection with a radio program about her. I found this very interesting and remarkable piece, and it was certainly the sort of piece that Liszt might have written towards the end of his life. Later I saw the volume of her published works, which contain pieces by Beethoven, Schubert, Chopin, and others, as well as Liszt, and all of these I found very interesting musically, and I'm sure that they could not have been written in the form of a pastiche, like a professional composer would do. Because I understand that Mrs. Brown has had very little training and has to take these pieces down note by note. So it is clear that they must come from somewhere outside. And I believe that she is doing an extremely good work in letting us have these pieces.
If it came from my subconscious mind, I would be sure, I think, to have some idea. Before it was dictated to me, I would have some idea of what the music was going to be. And it comes, totally sort of out of the blue, as we say. I have, of course, worked sometimes with people watching, with witnesses. For instance, with the BBC, that was a very notable occasion. When the BBC here in London asked me if I would try to work with one of the composers while they were watching and recording on a tape recorder. And so I sent a sort of mental request out to the composers to say if any of them wanted to try to come and work while the BBC was there, would they please come? So we sat in the room at my house with Geoffrey Skelton and Daniel Snowman and an engineer with a tape recorder. And I didn't know who would come or if anybody would come at all. But then I saw that Liszt was there, and he said he had a piece of music to try to transmit to me. And he gave, first of all, the number of sharps in the piece of music, which was 6. He didn't name the key, because, you see, I don't recognise the keys by their names very well, so it's better for them to give just the number of sharps or flats in the key signature. Then he said the piece of music was 5/4 in the right hand and 3/2 in the left hand, and I began by then to get rather worried because I thought 6 sharps and these 2 different rhythms, it's going to be a very difficult piece to get transmitted over to me. Then he dictated, I think, 4 bars first of all of the left hand. Then he began to dictate the right hand, and so he went on, section by section, until I had about a couple of dozen bars. And it looked very strange on paper, it seemed to wander about all over the place, and there seemed to be a lot of accidentals thrown in and strange-looking chords. And I began to get very worried about it. I thought it could be total nonsense. It could be a terrible-sounding piece of music. So I said to the BBC, would you mind if I try to play what I have so far, because I want to know what it sounds like. And of course I couldn't play it, I couldn't read it, with the cross rhythms and all the sharps and things. It was too difficult for me to manage. But Geoffrey Skelton, who is a pianist, said, he would play it, or try to play it. So he sat down at the piano and looked through it, and then he played it through. And then he turned round very slowly and he said, Mrs. Brown, I think you've got something here. In other words, he felt sure that it was something worthwhile coming through. And I was very relieved to know it was a good piece of music coming through.
And did Liszt give this piece a name?
Not until he'd given me the complete piece of music. And then he said he wanted to call it Grubelei.
we hear the opinion of John Lill, well-known British concert pianist and Beethoven interpreter.
May I ask you what you feel about the claim that these composers really do send music down to earth, as it were, from where they are now? Can you yourself imagine that Beethoven is able or even interested to do such a thing?
Part of his mind is certainly interested, but the obvious facts remain that the mind, when it reaches spirit, does become larger and more all-engulfing. Consequently, the mind is more able to do more than one thing at once. So while part of his mind is based in spirit, certainly part of it is able to visit Earth, if only in order to see how things are going there and how his performances are going on, as it were. And certainly, with regard to people who are receptive, to try and communicate and make their lives better for the benefit of all people. I'm sure that this is the case. Why should one lose all interest in where one has come from?
Would you say that you are receptive yourself as a musician?
Yes, and I furthermore have received concrete evidence as to the existence of a continuity of life.
In which way?
In ways about which I shall publicize in a few years' time, but not now.
Could you perhaps give us an idea of what your feelings and impressions are whilst you are giving a concert?
Whilst giving a concert, one is totally involved with spiritual communication. If it were not for spiritual help and communication, I don't think there would be such a thing as great art. And when you recreate music, almost the same as when you create music, you are under the spell of very high and very profound thought, which do come from the divine intention. Consequently, my one ambition at a concert is to break the barrier with Earth as far as possible, and to become in a state whereby I try and bridge the gap between the two worlds. And in this condition, which borders on trance, I give my best performances. Since being convinced of spiritual help, I have never played better, I've never been in better health, and I have never had a better long-term objective with regard to reality than now. This is proof enough. Quite apart from this, I have received specific and total evidence, quite apart from music, as to the existence of colossal forces, which are available to all people, if only they will open their minds to it. But if you cut away the lake from the sea on which it is fed, you can only stagnate the lake.
Do you feel that these great composers are still somehow linked to their creation, that they're still somehow spiritually present when one of their works is being performed?
Yes, there is a link-up, and they are present if the minds of the performers are noble enough to achieve very high standards and very high ideals. But there is no shortcut to spiritual development, and it is up to the individual to raise himself to God and to the higher spirits. He cannot get it on a plate as a gift. It is up to you to sweat and to work towards this ideal with regard to performances. And when the performances merit it, and when the mind is sufficiently developed, as a true artistic mind should be, then all power is available from these great spirits. As I said before, the minds are infinite, and they can command many performances at once.
And the opinion of the Church.
It's important first, I think, to realize that the Church is the community that believes that the personality does survive death. Therefore, anything I say must be in that light. There is survival after death, and therefore it would be extraordinary if the Church didn't examine closely any claims from anyone who says that they receive communications from the dead. However, there has in the past been one major problem, and that is that the majority of those people who've made these claims have been outside the Church, indeed have been something of a challenge to the Church. In Rosemary Brown's case, of course, this is different. She is a member of the Church, and she is claiming as a member of the Church that she receives communications from persons, personalities, that have survived death and are still able to speak our language and communicate with us. The Church can't possibly find anything very extraordinary about that, for after all, the Church is founded upon the belief that a man, Jesus Christ, did survive death and personally appear to his disciples and his friends after his resurrection. The history of the church is one continuous catalogue of stories of people who, in marvelous circumstances very often, survived most terrible torture, bloodshed, murder, and appeared to their friends and sometimes to their enemies and demonstrated without any possible shadow of doubt that their personalities, their souls, survive and continue in a real way to live with God. The question must be whether anyone who makes these claims is making them for the right or for the wrong reasons. If they were made in an alarmist or in an inflammatory kind of way, it would be possible to claim that they are really only being made to make an impact and nothing more. But in Rosemary's case, that's not true. They're made in a quiet, in a realistic, in an unspectacular way, claiming that people who are definitely and truly dead, but some of whom are known by us and known by name, have survived to communicate with us. And what they communicate is something of importance, of interest, something that we don't know already, and that in some cases, things that they couldn't know themselves unless they were, in fact, survivors beyond the grave. I can see no reason at all why the Church shouldn't believe that this happens, and in my opinion, this is a clear example of persons from beyond the grave attempting to influence our material world.
After church opinion, back to Rosemary Brown's music.
Was halten Sie von Rosemarys Anspruch?
What do you think of Rosemary's claim that dead composers are trying, by these means, to demonstrate their continued existence? If it is too complicated to explain this music as a product of the subconscious, would parapsychology be prepared, in this case, to admit that the influence of discarnate beings is a distinct possibility, even a probability?
Wir haben in diesem Fall mit demjenigen zu tun, was Jung eine unbewusste Mehrleistung genannt hat.
We are dealing here with something that Jung would have called a heightened performance of the unconscious. And the question is, could influences from another world play a part in this?
Nicht verneinen, dass es jenseitige Einflüsse gibt.
I do not wish to dispute the possibility that influences from a spirit world may exist. But not to dispute it is not quite the same as to accept. Personally, I believe in an existence after death.
Es gibt wissenschaftlich keine Beweise, aber konvergente Argumente.
There's no scientific proof, only arguments supporting the possibility. Maybe that at some future time proof will be forthcoming. It is, in any case, a most interesting problem, and we'll have to go on studying it.
Und es muss weiter studiert werden. Ich glaube, dass jeder Parapsychologe seine eigene Meinung über diesen Fall hat.
I think parapsychologists have their own private opinions on this matter, and most of them do not dispute the possibility of influences from a beyond. There could be animistic explanations, but they are sometimes so fantastically complicated that one really has to ask whether the hypothesis of life after death is not the more acceptable one. But I couldn't commit myself any further.
Nicht annehmlicher ist, aber weiter kann ich nicht gehen.
We had invited Rosemary Brown to our flat to try to contact one of the composers whilst we were filming. She had agreed, but without promising that in such unaccustomed surroundings, and amidst the bustle of activities of a film crew, any results would be forthcoming. We had not yet finished setting up our equipment when Rosemary Brown suddenly rose from where she was sitting, walked over to the piano, and started writing down notes. After a while, she laid her pencil aside, turned to us, and declared that Beethoven had just told her to pause so that we could finish our preparations. We were all somewhat perplexed at this unexpected, helpful intervention. But Rosemary Brown seemed to think it quite natural that Beethoven should give directions from the beyond. The new piece of music was completed in approximately 1 hour, and what you are now witnessing is a summary of events in chronological order.
It's Beethoven telling me to try to hurry up. I can't go any faster. I've come to an easy part. It's the same 2 bars again with the right hand an octave higher, so I can just copy the previous 2 bars instead of trying to listen to what he's saying. See. It's so easy to make a mistake. I thought he said E and he said C. No, it sounds so much like C. C natural. No. Oh. So I've got that right. Goes up an octave. 4, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, believe it's right. Because it's right. Sometimes things look very strange on paper and you play them and you find it all right. Let's see. C. C. It's annoying when you suddenly you lose it.
Yes, by all means.
Don't know why it happens sometimes.
Would you like to take a break and have a...
I'll just relax a minute. Probably. Yes, I'll probably get a little bit tense, and if you keep relaxed, it comes more easily. It's Beethoven's still here. I can still see him. We've got quite a lot of music here now. I think there are some bars missing. When I took a break and then came back again, it seems to me that something was left out. In fact, Beethoven has told me that when I get to the end of this part, there should be 32 bars, and there are only 28, so obviously there are 4 bars gone adrift somewhere. But what we have so far, I would like to play through. Of course, I'm not a concert pianist, and I may have to play a little slowly. I may hesitate a little as I read it through, but it would be nice to hear what it sounds like.
Mrs. Brown, we have just heard a new scherzo by Beethoven, which you received here in Hampstead in this very flat. Can you tell us what actually happened on that day? Did you know that a composer would be present?
No, I didn't know for sure whether any composer would come, although I had notified them that we were meeting and that we were going to film. But before we began filming, I saw that Beethoven had arrived. He looked at me and he gave me a little half smile and a little nod, as much as to say, I am here, I am going to give you some music.
How do you communicate with the composers? Now, Beethoven, for instance, didn't speak any English when he was here on this earth.
Well, it doesn't matter whether spirits know English or not, because they can employ a spirit interpreter. But Beethoven has obviously taken the trouble to learn quite a lot of English since he passed over, so he can communicate with me direct.
Do you receive only piano music, or do you also get orchestral works? And what about songs? I'm particularly thinking of Schubert. Would he give you also the lyrics?
There is music other than piano music. There are orchestral pieces, string quartets, and so forth. And of course there are some symphonies, and there is one particular symphony from Beethoven which has drawn some attention. There are songs from various composers. I have several beautiful songs from Schubert, and he does give the words as well as the music.
How many composers are actually in spiritual contact with you now? And is this new music being published?
There would be about 24 composers in contact with me now. The music is being published in printed form and in records and on cassettes as well.
And how do the composers appear to you? Liszt, for instance, does he appear as a young man or as the venerable old abbé? And how do you see Beethoven? Does he look like the pictures we've got of him? And would Schubert still wear his glasses?
Well, Schubert, of course, wouldn't need glasses now. When he was in this world, obviously, he needed the glasses for his eyesight. But that was just a thing of the physical body. When people appear in spirit, as a rule, they try to represent themselves as they looked here, so that we can identify them. But as they evolve, they become often very radiant, and yet you would still know them. They still retain a look of themselves, so that you would know which person it is.
Now, talking about Schubert, there are skeptics who think that as you are in contact with Schubert, it should be possible for him to finish his unfinished symphony through you. Have you ever spoken to him about this?
Well, he volunteered the information that he has finished the unfinished symphony since his passing, and I wonder whether he would like to transmit it to us in this world. And he told me that he had decided to leave it as it was. He felt it left it as a mystery, and that in a way it was more romantic as an unfinished symphony.
I read in one of your books that once, when Leonard Bernstein was in London, you had to play for him. Can you tell us a little about that meeting, and what did he think of your music?
Well, that was a very exciting occasion. It was marvellous to meet Leonard Bernstein, and I found he was very friendly and sympathetic. He insisted at first in entertaining me. We had a meal together and so on. But all the time I could see he was very eager to get to the music. And I had taken with me a black briefcase full of music. And he looked at the case and said, "Tell me, what have you got in that mysterious black bag?" So I took out the music, and he had a piano in the room. He asked me whether I would play some of the music, which I did, although, of course, I'm not an expert pianist. And he became very excited, and then he sat down and played some of the music himself. There was a piece from Chopin, a long piece, which he loved very much. He kept playing that over and over again. And also there was one particular piece from Rachmaninoff which impressed him very much. And you could see that he felt this is a completely authentic breakthrough. It was very exciting for him and very exciting for me as well.
Mrs. Brown, you are usually spoken of as a music medium. Do only composers contact you?
No, the majority of spirits who communicate are not famous people, they're just ordinary people. But apart from the composers, other famous people from other walks of life have communicated with me. I've had communications from Einstein, from Jung, from Bertrand Russell. There seem to be people joining in this project from all walks of life. I think they're all working together to try to get the truth to us and to help us to understand more about this life and the next one and the purpose of life.
And I hear that for some time now you have also been doing psychic paintings. Who are the painters that inspire you?
I have been told by art experts that they are quite sure they can detect the influence of certain artists who have passed over. One of them is Van Gogh. In fact, this picture, which I painted under inspiration, has been identified as a Van Gogh.
Yes, that's very beautiful.
There are other painters who have been named. There is Turner.
Lovely.
And also Blake. This one is from Samuel Palmer.
Oh, that is most impressive. Now really, this is so exciting. You know, so you are a music medium and you get all these composers contacting you and famous people like Einstein and Jung and Bertrand Russell and these magnificent painters. You know, there's just one question I would like to ask you. Now, if you have been specially chosen for this task, could not all these great masters that contact you have made life just a little easier for you?
I think probably it was not within their power to make my life easier. We are all in the same position in this life. Things happen to us and we wonder why. I'm sure that almost everyone has a time in their life when they say, well, why did this have to happen to me? But I'm sure that behind everything that happens there is a reason and a purpose. I have suffered a great deal, but then many people do suffer very much in this world. But I hope that my suffering has made me a better and wiser person.
Sir Donald Tovey, who died in 1940 and now is one of Rosemary Brown's inspirers, dictated the following message to her in 1970.
A group of musicians who've left your world is trying, by means of communicating music and talks, to impress on mankind the fact that physical death is but a transition from one state of consciousness to another. Personality remains intact. By this method, we want to help man attain a better understanding of his true nature. The realization that life on earth is but one phase of man's eternal life should lead to clearer political vision of the world's leaders and to more sensible attitudes generally. We make contact and transmit our music not only to give pleasure to people, but because we want this phenomenon to arouse interest, so that open-minded people may be encouraged to probe the uncharted realms of the human soul and spirit. Man will then be able to rise to greater heights.